The sun was sinking low behind the jagged red hills when Elias Crow saw her collapse near the dry arroyo that cut through the edge of his ranch. And at first he thought the heat had finally driven his eyes mad, because no woman he had ever known, or even imagined, could have been built like that. She was tall, impossibly tall, her shadow stretching long across the cracked earth like a monument carved by the gods themselves, her shoulders broad and powerful, her arms corded with muscle earned from a life of survival, her dark hair braided thick and heavy down her back, and even as she fell to one knee and then to both, there was a presence about her that made the cicadas go quiet, and the wind seemed to hesitate, as if the land itself recognized her. Elias stood frozen on his porch, a tin cup in one hand and the reins of his horse in the other, his mind screaming at him to get inside, to grab his rifle, to shut his door and pretend he hadn't seen anything at all, because every man within 100 miles knew what it meant to see an Apache this close to home, especially one marked with the colors of a warrior and carrying a spear taller than most men. But something deeper than fear rooted him there, something old and stubborn and human, because she wasn't charging, she wasn't scouting, she wasn't signaling anyone else, she was dying of thirst right in front of him. Elias had lived alone since the war took his brother, and the frontier took his parents, and in all those years the land had taught him one brutal lesson above all others: water was life, and refusing it was a sin the desert never forgave. He stepped off the porch slowly, deliberately, so she could see his empty hands, so she could see that he wasn't reaching for a weapon, and with every step his heart hammered harder, his boots crunching against gravel that sounded far too loud in the growing stillness. She lifted her head then, and their eyes met across the last stretch of dust, and Elias felt something tighten in his chest, because her gaze wasn't wild or cruel like the stories said. It was sharp and steady and burning with intelligence. The eyes of someone who had buried people she loved and carried that weight every day without bowing under it. She didn't raise her spear, didn't shout, didn't threaten him, she just watched him, measuring him the way hunters measure the wind, and when she spoke her voice was low, roughened by thirst and travel, but unmistakably calm. "Water," she said, not begging, not demanding, just stating a truth as simple as the sun overhead. Elias swallowed, nodded once, and slowly lifted the tin cup, pouring water from the canteen he carried everywhere like a second heart, the clear liquid splashing into the cup and catching the last light of the day like silver. He took another step forward and set the cup on a flat rock between them, then backed away 2 full paces, raising his hands again. For a long moment nothing happened, and Elias wondered if he had just signed his own death warrant, if somewhere beyond the hills unseen warriors were already watching, already marking him as a fool. But then she crawled forward, her movements heavy and strained, and picked up the cup with hands that could have crushed his skull like an egg. She drank slowly at first, then faster, water spilling down her chin and darkening the earth beneath her, and when the cup was empty she closed her eyes and exhaled like someone who had been holding their breath for days. Elias filled it again, setting it down the same way, and again she drank, and only after the 3rd cup did some of the tension ease from her massive frame. When she finally spoke again, it wasn't to threaten him or claim his land, it was to give him her name. "Nantai," she said, placing a hand over her chest, and though Elias didn't know the language well, he understood enough to know names were not given lightly among her people. "Elias," he replied, his voice hoarse, tapping his own chest in return, and for a moment, just a moment, the frontier wasn't divided by blood and history and fear, but held together by 2 exhausted souls standing in the same dying light. Nantai rose to her feet then, towering over him so completely that Elias had to tilt his head back to meet her eyes. And yet she didn't loom or posture. She simply stood, steady as a mountain, and inclined her head in what could only be respect. She gestured to the horizon, to the long stretch of land she had crossed alone, and then to the water, and Elias understood without words that this was not forgotten. Without another sound she turned and walked back toward the hills, her stride slow but unbroken, until the dust swallowed her and the desert returned to its usual restless noise. Elias stood there long after she was gone, the tin cup still in his hand, knowing deep in his bones that the stories never told the whole truth, and that something had shifted the moment he chose mercy over fear. That night, he barely slept, the moonlight pouring through his windows like a warning, every creak of the ranch setting his nerves on edge, his rifle within arm's reach but untouched, because he couldn't shake the feeling that violence would not be what came knocking with the dawn. When morning finally broke, it came not with birdsong or breeze, but with the low thunder of footsteps, hundreds of them, vibrating through the ground itself, and when Elias stepped out onto his porch and looked across his land, his breath left him in a single stunned gasp, because surrounding his ranch in a wide, unbroken circle stood 300 Apache warriors. Faces painted, weapons ready, silent as the grave, and at their center, tall as ever, stood Nantai, watching him with the same steady eyes as the day before. If your heart is already racing and you want to know what happens when mercy is repaid not with death, but with destiny, make sure you subscribe to this channel now, because what follows will change everything Elias thought he knew about honor, survival, and the true meaning of strength in a land that shows none. The silence was heavier than gunfire, and Elias Crow felt it pressing down on him as he stood on his porch with 300 Apache warriors surrounding his ranch, their presence so complete and deliberate that it felt as though the land itself had chosen sides overnight, and yet not a single arrow was nocked, not a single rifle raised, not a single voice lifted in threat, only the steady, patient stillness of people who knew exactly who they were and why they had come. Elias's instincts screamed at him to move, to do something, but another part of him, the same part that had stepped forward with water instead of a weapon the day before, understood that this moment demanded stillness above all else, because fear would be read as guilt, and aggression would be answered in kind. Nantai stood at the center of the great circle, taller than any warrior beside her, her posture straight and unyielding, the morning sun catching the beadwork and feathers woven into her hair, and when she raised one hand, the warriors did not move, but the air itself seemed to shift, as though the desert were leaning in to listen. She stepped forward alone, crossing the open ground between herself and the porch with long, confident strides, and Elias noticed then that she was no longer weakened by thirst. She moved like someone fully restored, fully present, carrying not only her own strength, but the authority of those who followed her. When she stopped a few paces away, she did not reach for her spear, nor did Elias reach for his rifle, and for a moment they simply looked at one another again, two people bound by a choice that could not be undone. "You gave water," Nantai said, her voice carrying easily across the open space, and Elias nodded once, knowing better than to dress it up with excuses or false humility. "You crossed death," she continued, and though he did not fully understand the words, he felt their weight, because on the frontier death was not a metaphor, it was a line drawn in dust and blood, and he had stepped over it when he chose mercy. Nantai turned then, gesturing to the warriors behind her, and for the first time Elias truly saw them not as a faceless threat, but as individuals, men young and old, faces marked by scars and stories, eyes sharp with vigilance but not cruelty, and he understood that he was, not standing before an execution squad, but a council. "These are my people," Nantai said, her hand resting briefly over her heart, "and I am their shield." The words settled into Elias's chest like a truth he had always known but never named, because he too had once been a shield, for his brother in the war, for his parents when the land turned cruel, and he knew the cost of carrying that responsibility. Nantai explained then, slowly and deliberately, that she was not merely a warrior, but a war leader, one who had crossed enemy territory alone to secure a fragile peace between tribes fractured by hunger and broken treaties, and that her collapse near Elias's ranch had not been weakness, but the last test of a body pushed beyond its limits. When she spoke of thirst, she did not speak only of water, but of a land drying under the weight of endless conflict, of children learning to carry knives before they learned to laugh, of elders remembering a time when mercy was not mistaken for surrender. Elias listened, his hand loose at his sides, the old rifle leaning against the porch untouched, and for the first time in years he felt something stir in him beyond survival, a sense that his small, lonely patch of land might matter in ways he had never imagined. Nantai stepped closer then, lowering her voice so that only he could hear, and told him that some among her people had argued for blood when they found her alive, that they had followed her trail expecting to avenge her death, and that it was only her word, her authority, that held them back. "I told them you chose life," she said simply, and Elias felt his throat tighten, because choosing life on the frontier was rarely rewarded, and never without cost. She asked him then if the water he gave was given freely, or if he expected something in return, And Elias answered without hesitation, because the truth was the only thing he had left to offer. "I gave it because no one deserves to die like that," he said, his voice rough but steady, and Nantai studied him for a long moment before nodding once, a sharp, decisive motion that carried the weight of judgment. She turned back to her people and spoke in her own language, her words flowing fast and strong, and though Elias did not understand them, he felt their impact ripple through the circle, felt the tension shift into something else, something like resolve. One by one, the warriors lowered their weapons, not as a sign of weakness, but as a declaration, and when they did, Elias realized he had been holding his breath since dawn. Nantai faced him again and delivered the truth that would change his life forever. His ranch sat on land that would soon become a corridor of war, a place where rival forces would clash and innocence would be crushed between them. And because he had shown mercy when none was owed, her people would not only spare him, but protect him. The offer was not framed as charity or alliance, but as balance, a life preserved for a life safeguarded, and Elias understood that refusing would not undo what had already been set in motion. He agreed, not with a handshake or a contract, but with a nod and a promise spoken from the gut, and in response, Nantai planted her spear into the earth at the edge of his land, a marker not of ownership, but of guardianship. The warriors remained for only a short time after that, long enough to scout the surrounding hills and ensure no immediate danger lurked nearby, and when they finally departed, it was not in secrecy or haste, but openly, leaving tracks that told anyone watching that this land was no longer unclaimed. As the dust settled and the last of them vanished into the distance, Elias found himself standing alone again, but the loneliness felt different now, less like abandonment and more like purpose. In the weeks that followed, word spread quickly across the fro. Tyr, carried by traders and drifters and men who understood the language of survival better than politics, and Elias's ranch became known not as a weak target, but as a place marked by something older and stronger than fear. Nantai returned only once more before winter, this time with elders and children, and they shared food and stories beneath the open sky, not as enemies or saviors, but as people bound by a single choice that had rippled outward into something far greater than either of them. Elias never claimed to understand the Apache way, just as they never claimed to understand his, but understanding was never the point. Respect was, and in a land built on taking, respect was the rarest currency of all. Years later, when Elias would sit on his porch watching the sun sink behind the same red hills, he would think back to the day he offered water to a dying stranger, and how close he had come to turning away. And he would know with absolute certainty that the smallest acts of mercy could summon forces powerful enough to change destinies. And if this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you that courage doesn't always roar, that sometimes it kneels and offers a cup of water, then subscribe to this channel now, because these are the stories that deserve to be told, stories where humanity survives even in the harshest lands, and where one choice can echo across history forever.